According to a recent report published by UNESCO on behalf of UN Water, 2.2 billion people still live without access to safely managed drinking water, and 3.5 billion people lack access to safely managed sanitation. Their conclusions found that ensuring a water-secure future that supports peace and prosperity requires increasing the quantity and quality of water-related investments. In the past 2 decades, droughts affected more than 1.4 billion people. As of 2022, roughly half of the world's population experienced severe water scarcity for at least part of the year. According to UNESCO, climate change is projected to increase the frequency and severity of these phenomena, with acute risk for social stability. While this is a current reality for almost a quarter of humanity, our top scientists are busy considering how to build and colonize the Moon and Mars. A mere trip to gather samples from the desolate plains of Mars would come at the expense of billions of dollars, with results that would take decades from being realized. Enormous amounts of labor and capital are being spent on these endeavors while overlooking the enormous amount of untapped capacity here on Earth. There are approximately 19 million square miles of desert land here on Earth, which constitutes about a third of the Earth's surface. Desert is defined as arid land with sparse vegetation, specifically receiving less than 25 centimeters or 10 inches of rainfall annually. It is largely a result of environmental factors which keep deserts in a feedback loop of no precipitation. The Arctic and Antarctic make up close to 11 million square miles of this land, leaving 8 million square miles of desert spread around the Earth. This is larger than 2 full-size United States worth of land. 3/4 of this desert land borders an ocean with thousands of miles of coastline. This is land we could transform into habitable and eventually productive arable land, and I will address how it can be done. When I look at the deserts of Earth, I don't see wasteland and desolation. I see potential. In my opinion, what we need to combat climate change is more climate change. We need to get ahead of it, and we can do so by geoengineering our planet's deserts. This endeavor should take precedence over Moon and Mars missions. There is no reason to travel hundreds of millions of miles through space to bring life to a desert planet when we haven't brought life to the deserts on this planet. I have a plan that will help neutralize man-made climate change. It will neutralize the threat of rising sea levels. It will store more CO2 over time than any other industrial scheme possible. It will create environments that will preserve more and greater biodiversity, and in the long term, create arable and well-watered land to accommodate billions of people. This is done by turning the desert waste of Earth into fertile forests. This is a process that will take a few decades, but would help alleviate many of our future generations' problems with the looming water and land scarcity they will face. I have invented a device which I call Miner's Distilator. This device, if used in conjunction with my plan, could change these deserts into flourishing forests. Before I go any further, I understand there will be those who have reasonable objections to this proposal. However, I ask you to be mindful of one thing, namely, the importance of this land being productive and inhabitable is more important to humanity's future than all objections presented. This is a solution to a big problem. If we make more big problems as a result, we'll find solutions for those as well. It is what humans are good at. To those who are concerned about issues that may arise from this geoengineering project, I have this to say. Every generation is faced with their own problems they must solve. This is part of the collective human experience. I'd rather leave our children too much nature, too much fresh water, and too much life, and the problems that come with it, rather than not enough nature, water, or life, and the problems that come with that. Let me explain what my invention does, and then I'll share my vision of how it can be used. My device will create pure, distilled water from seawater. I've modeled it to run on propane, since that would be ideal in an off-grid situation. The device has very low maintenance and no moving parts. it can also be designed to operate on electricity instead. I have made models to show both. My vision would see these distillators spaced out along the coastlines of deserts around the world. They would be spaced every half mile or about 800 meters. They would have a fuel or electric line running to them underwater and a distilled water line running back to shore above water. Where the distilled water line reaches the shore, a plastic-lined channel for the water would be dug. The channel's length will travel inland and grow over time. It will likely need a series of pools and pumps along the way to help it overcome differences in elevation. Along this plastic-lined channel, thousands of microchannels will be cut into the desert sand, leading hundreds of meters in each direction. These microchannels will be used to drip irrigate thousands and eventually millions of differing species of trees. This will require enormous manpower, of course. My estimate would be 10 people for every distillator. People need water too, so you don't want to overburden the production of the distillator while trying to geoengineer the terrain. For example, let's say we decided to do a 1,000-mile stretch of desert coastline. This would require 2,000 distillators and 20,000 people. These could be volunteers from abroad. We could find 20,000 out of 8 billion people willing to be our Earth Warrior volunteers and commit a year of their life to the cause. I have faith there are at least this many environmentally minded young people who would love such an opportunity. As our Lord Jesus Christ said, "It is more blessed to give than receive." It is the human desire to be a part of something bigger than ourselves, to look back and be acknowledged for providing a better world for millions, possibly billions of people would be a great honor. We could rotate out those who have completed their time each year for fresh volunteers. They would need food and shelter in addition to the fertilizers, tools, seeds, and everything else required to complete the mission. What they learned the first few years would set the template for all successive years. This type of volunteerism and water management to bring water to the desert using miners' distillators would be the most fiscally conservative approach for long-term water security in distant regions of the world. If volunteers can't be found, we could allocate money to pay poor, unemployed people in the affected countries to do the work. The bottom line is that if we throw enough water, manpower, and vegetation at this problem, we can break the cycles that cause deserts to be deserts. Others have put forth similar plans, which have put the price of greening just the Sahara Desert alone at anywhere from $1.9 billion a year to as much as $2 trillion a year. I believe with my invention and plan, we can do that at a much lower and reasonable cost. With a higher initial startup cost than propane, electric-powered distillation may be the way to go. 2,000 distillators would require hundreds of solar arrays costing as much as $1 billion. Since the energy would be used solely for the purpose of the project, there would be no need for battery storage. The power could go straight from generation to the heating element. And while propane can operate continuously, electric models could only operate on average 10 to 12 hours per day when the sun is shining. A benefit to this downtime, however, is the dissolution of accumulated salt back into the ocean throughout nighttime hours. While electric-powered distillation makes for a heavy upfront cost, the hardware only needs purchased once. For places like Australia and countries on the Arabian Peninsula that currently have available electrical power, transmission lines could be ran to the distillators and power them directly. While the immediate price of this water will be expensive, the long-term effects of the water and vegetation can eventually break the environmental cycles creating desert conditions, even on continental scales. The result of accomplishing this is invaluable. The end goal is to capture, restore, and expand the freshwater cycle in the water-scarce places of Earth, as well as capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In the future, this increased water cycle could produce and supply new rivers, lakes, and aquifers for growing populations. The capillary distribution of fresh water on the sand, in addition to the shade from the plants, will allow more water vapor from the ocean to condense over the desert and precipitate both by the shore and eventually further inland. Once the forests are well established, the combined water from evaporation and the transpiration of the plants will also begin to form cloud cover and precipitate, thereby creating a positive feedback loop of the water cycle. This will continue the cooling process of the desert surface, allowing more water to enter and remain in the environment. Eventually, as trees and bushes shed leaves, ground cover will begin to accumulate. This will allow the growth of organisms that will turn organic plant matter into soil. Long-rooted grasses should be gradually introduced to help speed up the process of transforming the soil. Over the course of decades, this vegetation and water will enrich the land and make it suitable for agricultural use. Proper management of land will ensure it remains arable for future generations. This transformation of vast land area would provide room for trillions of new animals to produce and thrive. As a safeguard, we could preserve 2 to 3% of the current deserts as habitats for all the desert species in the world. Most species would simply adapt to the changing environment as has happened since the beginning of time. Some may argue the distillators will damage the ocean. The two main types of water desalination, reverse osmosis filtration and multi-stage flash distillation, dump highly salinated brine water directly back into the ocean in vast quantities as a byproduct of their operation. My invention will be like 1,000 pinpoints of high salinity stretched over hundreds of miles. It is scientifically documented and proven that if nature is left alone, it will heal and restore itself. This is evidenced by studies of rainforest, which were cut down and grew back on their own, as well as the Pacific atolls, where multiple nuclear tests were conducted. If we run this geoengineering project for 25 years and complete it, the ocean will heal itself in a matter of time and will be just fine. Any accumulated salt will eventually dissolve back into the ocean and reach a point of normal salinity again. All the CO2 expelled in the process will be absorbed by the forest we grow. That's how my device can be used to fulfill my plan. Now, for those who would like an in-depth look at how my distillator works, I've prepared a technical description the best I could. I also have a release of patent with the full description of the device along with the 3D models. The propane and electric-powered versions of this invention described herein are to be considered a means to supply Miner's distillator as a geoengineering device in remote off-grid places where it can be fueled by propane gas or solar power with very minimal maintenance. It could also be used on ocean-going vessels as a means of water desalination while at sea. I believe it may also have a use in the gas and oil industry by means of using waste byproducts to fuel the distillator and utilize it to purify water contaminated by gas and oil extraction. Miner's distillator consists of two tubes, an inner inside tube and an outer outside tube, of a saltwater and temperature-resistant plastic of similar length. The smaller diameter inner tube is posited within the larger diameter outer tube with a gap between them sufficient for the steam piping and the air and fuel supply piping to fit. The inside tube remains open at the bottom to allow seawater to fill its volume, while the gap between the inside and outside tubes are sealed at the bottom, creating an airtight seal between the tubes. The top portion of the inside wall of the inside tube, that which is in contact with boiling water and steam, will be coated with a heat and saltwater resistant ceramic, fiberglass, or other heat protective material sufficient to insulate the top of the inside tube from heat deformation. A fuel and air supply line running through the gap between the inside and outside tubes will bring oxygen and fuel down to burner assemblies that are inserted and rest suspended in seawater within the inside tube. These burner assemblies will have stainless steel pipes that go up through the subdome and dome to transfer heat and exhaust upwards. Subdome is defined in this description as the dome that covers only the inside tube, thereby differentiating it from the dome covering the outside tube. The inner inside tube and the outer outside tube are sealed with a gap between them. A vacuum is pulled within this gap in order to minimize any thermal losses from the stainless steel pipes transferring the high pressure steam, as well as to minimize thermal transfer between heated seawater within the inside tube and colder seawater outside the outer tube. The stainless steel piping transferring steam will begin at the subdome, travel throughout the vacuum-sealed gap, and re-enter through the inside tube below the heat exchanger assembly. It will then coil its way down, suspended in the seawater, until it terminates in a straight pipe and exits through the bottom of the inside tube. It will then rise vertically to a height several meters above sea level outside the outer tube. At the maximum height of this pipe, it will be joined to tubing that will extend to the shore as it gradually slopes downward past the shoreline. The inside tube will be sealed by the subdome, and the outside tube will be sealed at the top with a dome. There will be a vacuum-sealed gap between the subdome and dome as well. The conjoined tubes are submerged vertically in the water, while the upper portion, specifically the subdome and dome, remains above water. The device is buoyant, so it will float in the water. It will need anchors and framing to stabilize it in place at the correct height. Fuel from a propane tank is fed to the burner assembly through the fuel and air supply pipe. The burner is ignited and begins to heat up. The burner assembly acts as a heat transfer carriage similar to a normal residential or commercial gas furnace. However, instead of air moving over the burner assembly, as is the case in a modern forced air furnace, the seawater will be the medium into which heat is transferred. This will effectively boil the seawater. As the water is boiled, the steam will rise into the subdome. Since the steam is at high pressure inside the subdome, it forces its way out of the inside tube through an opening in the subdome and down into the stainless steel piping located in the gap between the inside and outside tubes. Since this gap is a vacuum, there's almost no thermal loss in this transition, as the tube remains extremely hot and the steam remains a vapor as it travels downwards. This high-pressure steam, which travels from the subdome into the vacuum-sealed gap, then enters back into the inside tube at an area just below the heat exchangers. As the pipe re-enters the inside tube, the steam begins to shed its heat as it warms the cooler seawater within. This thermal transfer preheats the water before it rises to the burner assembly. As the steam loses its latent heat, it condenses back into purified water. As this purified water travels down the coiled piping, it continues to shed its sensible heat into the surrounding seawater. This preheated seawater is forced upwards to the heat exchanger as a result of atmospheric pressure and fluid mechanics seeking to fill the tube and replace the water which is being boiled into steam at the top of the column. The stainless steel pipe coils its way just far enough down the inside tube to bring it to thermal equilibrium with the seawater, meaning it has shed all of its heat into the colder seawater. The pipe then proceeds vertically downwards as a straight pipe until it exits through the hole in the bottom of the inside tube. The pipe then curves underneath the tubing and travels up the outside tube into the air to a height several meters above sea level. The high-pressure steam will supply enough force to push the freshly distilled water through the stainless steel piping vertically until it reaches its apex. Once it reaches a determined height, it travels through descending piping to the shoreline by the force of gravity. As part of the natural process of water separation, less dense hot water will rise in the inside tube as denser cold water settles. Since this is a closed system at the dome subdome, it does not have atmospheric pressure acting on top of it. The distillator relies on atmospheric pressure and fluid mechanics to push water vertically upward into the inside chamber. At sea level, there is 1 atmosphere of pressure acting on the water surface. At 33 feet underwater, there are 2 atmospheres of pressure. The model pictured is 8 meters or 24 feet underwater. Therefore, 1.66 atmospheres of pressure are forcing water up into the tube. This pressure of new seawater entering in to replace boiled seawater ensures that the hot boiling water stays at the top of the inside tube, and that the cold seawater being heated by the thermal transfer of the steam pipe will also rise. This, in effect, is a heat transfer cycle that recycles most of the heat from the steam. Let's assume the burner assembly will be operating at around 80% efficiency, with 20% losses directly through exhaust. This is necessary because without an induction motor, which requires electricity, to expel the exhaust gases, they have to rise naturally. The combustion gases must therefore exit the exhaust pipe hot enough to ensure the water vapor byproducts of the propane combustion do not condense and drip down into the burner assembly. Having the exhaust chambers pass through the steam collection area in the subdome increases the temperature of the steam and helps it remain as vapor in this high pressure area. The volume expansion of water to steam is 1,600 times greater than the water volume occupied. As a result, this superheated steam also has the energy to push water through the other end of the condensing pipe. On a side note, the combustion of propane produces water vapor, so if we could find a way to capture the water vapor produced by the combustion, we could add that to our output. This could be done by adding an induction motor, which would also increase the efficiency of the system, but that would require additional energy and servicing. Let's assume the steam heat, both latent and sensible, being fed back into the seawater is around 80% efficient as well. In theory, that would mean the system turns every gallon of burned propane into 1.44 gallons of propane worth of heat in terms of thermal transfer. 80% burn efficiency times 80% heat capture efficiency equals 64%, which is added to the original burn. 80% plus 64% equals 144% efficiency from this model. This is due to recycling the heat back into the system. While flash distillation plants can repeatedly capture the latent heat from the distillation process, you can only do so much in an off-grid, low-cost, low-maintenance situation. An electric version of this distillator would use heating elements suspended in the water instead of the gas-powered heat transfer exhaust pipes. This would essentially require one large wire being fed into the tube to supply power. This heating element would require a high current and high wattage to supply the needed electricity for operation. In comparison to the propane-powered distillator, the initial efficiency of the electric-powered distillator would be around 95% with 80% return thermal transfer. This equates to about 170% efficiency for the energy put into the system. This makes solar power electrical the most efficient means of operation of the distillators. Efficiency above 100% does not mean breaking the laws of thermodynamics. A certain amount of energy is needed to turn seawater at ambient water temperature to steam distillate. The water must be heated to 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, and it must then absorb enough latent heat to phase change from water into steam. 100% efficiency means our steam output is the maximum possible for the energy input. Since this device recycles the latent and sensible heat energy required to turn water into steam distillate, I consider its efficiency to be greater than 100%. Some other considerations about this device is that as the water boils off at the top of the water column, the salt concentration will increase. This salt concentration will reach a point of supersaturation and will begin to precipitate in the solution. Since salt molecules weigh 3 times as much as water, the salt will rain down from the top of the column towards the ocean floor. As it passes through the cooler seawater coming in, this salt will reach thermal equilibrium with the water. This helps preserve the heat energy inside the distillator's inner tube. The salt will then fall to the seafloor, where it will gradually dissolve back into the ocean as a result of waves and currents. One issue that would need resolved is to build a barrier to keep sea life out of the intake while allowing salt to fall unimpeded to the ocean floor. For those wondering, 2,000 distillators using 90,000 gallons of propane every 300 days is roughly equivalent to 240 million gallons of propane per year. This is approximately 0.2 to 0.5% of global annual propane consumption. So, over 25 years of geoengineering the desert, we would expect to use somewhere between 5% and 12.5% of just 1 year's annual global consumption of propane. This is all just a rough calculation with a rough outline of what could be. Thank you for listening.